Oxford has its own way of keeping secrets. A cry by the river, a missing book, and a letter written in the past tense. She was silenced. No body, no report, no crime. Just a voice fading into rain, and the hint of a woman who sings no more. Before we begin, where are you listening from tonight? It was one of those Oxford mornings that pretends not to exist. Neither wet nor dry, neither early nor late. The kind of morning you forget as you live it. I'd stopped at Blackwell's without purpose, drifting past spines like faces at a funeral, pausing at Rossetti's Goblin Market, though I knew the lines by heart. She had a way with grief, gently biting, never pleading. I ran my thumb along the edges, soft with time, and thought perhaps I'd buy it again. I didn't. I never do. Somewhere nearby, the bells were doing their half-hearted routine, more memory than music. I stepped out into the high, just as the sky gave up its last pretense of sun. There were no bodies yet, just the usual foot traffic and the ache in my knee made worse by rain and memory. 2 days later, Lewis brought the letter in with a look I'd seen before. Part curiosity, part reluctance. No name, no address. Only the sort of envelope you'd expect to find in an elderly uncle's bureau drawer, tucked behind a bundle of string. The handwriting was female, not young, not old, studied, the sort that knew the difference between silence and secrecy. She was silenced, that's all they ever wanted. I read it twice, then once more, with whiskey. The phrasing caught me. Not she is, but she was. Past tense. A claim without a crime, and yet the cry by the river had been real enough. Reported by a boy of 10 who described it, haltingly, as the sort of sound someone makes when they think no one can hear. A poor phrase, but there was something in it that stayed with me. That strange idea of crying privately into an indifferent wind. The boy's parents had written it off as imagination. No girl had been reported missing. No accidents logged, no students unaccounted for. And yet, I asked Lewis to check the punts. He looked at me the way he does when I drift from what's practical. But he did it. Nothing, no scratches, no drag marks, no sign of damage. I could have dropped it then. I nearly did. Instead, I returned to Blackwell's the next morning. Rossetti's copy was gone. I asked the girl behind the counter if it had been sold. She didn't know. She had an eyebrow piercing and smelled faintly of jasmine and printer ink. Not unkind. I nodded and left. That evening I walked along the Cherwell, pausing beneath Magdalen Bridge. The water here moves differently. Not quickly, but with intention. You wouldn't notice unless you watched for a while, and I did. No cry came. Just the hum of bicycles and the odd tourist voice, sharp against the dusk. The next morning, Lewis mentioned a residence near St. Hilda's, Magdalen Court, that had once housed music, students now mostly lecturers and postgraduate women. A quiet place, the sort of building whose walls carried more secrets than sound. No incidents, he said, but a porter had remembered a girl crying in the garden weeks ago. I didn't reply. I was still thinking about the letter. It had no smudges, no tears, written deliberately. But the sentence, that's all they ever wanted, bothered me. They. Who were they? That afternoon I returned to my office, where the smell of damp wool and old files was its own form of comfort. I poured a second glass and stared at the envelope again. The Oxford postmark wasn't recent. 2 days old by the time it reached us. Delayed or deliberate? On the back of the letter, a faint indentation, barely a mark. But under the desk lamp, tilted just right, it caught. 2 lines, erased or never fully formed. I traced them lightly. Magdalen holds her secrets well. Ask the woman who sings no more. Poetry again, or theatre, or neither. A private performance meant only for me. I rang Lewis, told him to arrange a visit to Magdalen Court and bring walking shoes. Sometimes it doesn't begin with a body, just a voice, a line, a shadow in a sentence. But eventually it always ends the same, in silence. It had rained the night before. The stones in Magdalen Court still held the moisture like old lungs learning to breathe again. It was the sort of rain that leaves nothing gleaming, only dulled, the kind that quietly rewrites corners and paintwork. Lewis's shoes were already damp when we crossed the square. Mine too, though I said nothing. You reach a point, eventually, when the discomfort of things no longer surprises you. Mr. Greaves met us beneath the archway with the expression of a man who had just finished a bowl of porridge and resented the memory of it. A grey wool cardigan, too large for his frame, drooped at the sleeves, and his breath smelled faintly of pipe smoke and tea. No incidents, he assured us. Nothing unusual, certainly no missing girls. I asked who was in residence. 4 women, he said. All accounted for. All seen this morning, though he admitted Julia tended to rise late. I asked if we might speak to them. He hesitated only slightly before nodding, then led us through a corridor lined with once ornate plasterwork, long since tired of being admired. The west wing was still. Not quiet, still. There's a difference. Professor Cecily Brooke opened her door the way one opens an exam paper, quickly and with contempt for whoever set the question. Her face held the brittleness of someone who had been called clever far too young and spent the rest of her life defending the title. I introduced myself. She nodded once. Said she taught medieval Latin textual transmission and that she was behind on marking. I asked if she had known a tenant named Eleanor Payne. She furrowed, not quite frowning. The name rang faintly. She thought she had paid rent late. Vague, distracted, possibly American. She had left in May. Was it May? Yes, May. Emily Vaughan lived 2 doors down, younger, softer-voiced, all sleeves and shyness. She wore her hair in a way that tried to suggest she hadn't thought about it. She was writing a thesis on forgotten women poets of the interwar years, she said. I wondered if that was simply projection. When I asked about Eleanor, she paused longer than Cecily had. Yes, she remembered her. She had admired Eleanor's mind, or perhaps envied it. Hard to tell. She glanced down when she spoke the name. She's gone now, Emily said, as though that answered more than it did. The third was Helena Stourton, former theatre. Still had the voice. Slightly too precise, vowels trimmed to performance. Administrator now, though she spoke of it as a kind of exile. She wore silk indoors. Helena smiled when I asked about Eleanor, but the smile was rehearsed. Said she hadn't spoken much to the girl. They passed in hallways. She might have borrowed a kettle once. And then Julia Levison, the housekeeper. She took longer to appear. Greaves fetched her eventually. A widow of some years, she had once been a soprano of middling renown. There were programs in her small sitting room, faded and stacked beneath a cracked metronome. She said Eleanor had been quiet, kept to herself. Nice enough. The phrase people always use when they're trying not to speak ill of the disappeared. I noticed a photograph on the mantel. Julia in Rome, perhaps 30 years ago, beside a woman I half recognized. But the frame was smudged, the glass cracked just so. I didn't ask. When we returned to Greaves' desk, I asked to see the register. He obliged. It was paper, bound in green leather, the spine peeling, and it had the smell of every storage room I've ever known, ink, mildew, and resignation. I flipped through the pages, names, dates, footnotes in multiple hands. And then I saw it. A name, crossed out with more pressure than the pen had required. Not erased, struck, not once but 3 times. Deliberate, not bureaucratic. Eleanor Payne. Greaves said nothing. I closed the book slowly. Outside, The rain had begun again. Small, apologetic drops. I stood for a moment in the archway. Across the lawn, the windows of the west wing glowed faintly. One curtain twitched. The library bell rang distantly, though I'd lost all sense of the hour. Something had been undone. Not violently, not publicly, but undone all the same. And I was beginning to suspect that this silence was not absence, but arrangement. She hadn't been registered with any of the colleges. No active email on record. No alumni file, no bursar's note. Just a name, Eleanor Payne, crossed out in ink and remembered only with the sort of hesitance people reserve for old dinner guests. Vaguely fond, slightly embarrassed, difficult to place. Cecily Brooke, ever precise, had described her as vague, dreamy, forgetful. She smiled as she said it, but the smile was for herself, a scholar's indulgence. She supposed Eleanor had left sometime in spring, though she couldn't be certain. There had been a conversation, formal, civil, terminal. The phrase mutual agreement had been used, though I've found such things are rarely mutual, and even more rarely agreements. Emily Vaughan had not smiled. When the name was spoken, she had looked down at her hands, as though checking for ink. She said nothing at first. Then, quietly, she recalled Eleanor's fondness for obscure anthologies, especially those without footnotes. She liked poems that felt unfinished, Emily said. Fragments. I asked if they'd been friends. She paused, then shook her head too quickly, too absolutely. Not really. It was Helena who interrupted the silence. She'd poured herself a generous glass of something dark and Portuguese and asked if I would join her. I declined. Theatrical women rarely pour wine without purpose. I've never liked being part of their productions. Later, as dusk cooled the city's facades, I walked back alone. The sky above St. Clement's was the color of old bruises. A pedestrian coughed somewhere behind me, the sort of sound that echoes even when it doesn't. I felt unusually tired. I told myself it was the weather, but I knew better. Back in my flat, I didn't undress. I didn't eat. I placed the small Magdalene Court pamphlet on the table. I'd found it earlier, half crumpled in a bin beside the porter's shed. It was a campus map, printed on poor stock, but what caught my attention was the handwriting on the reverse. Small, italic, elegant. What lips my lips have kissed and where and why, I have forgotten. A line. Familiar, but off. Malay, yes. A sonnet. But there was something misaligned. It was the rhythm. The and why should have come later, shouldn't it? Or not at all. The way it was written here felt added, as if the original had been altered, nudged. I found the poem in an old anthology I kept near the record player. Opened it. Read both side by side. The rhythm had indeed shifted. Eleanor hadn't quoted Millet. She'd answered her. I poured myself something middling and turned on the record. Dido and Aeneas, Act 3. The aria where Dido pleads to be remembered, even as she prepares to vanish. It had always unnerved me. This time, it simply exhausted me. Eleanor Payne, a girl whose name had been erased with more intention than malice. No college, no affiliation, no surviving record but a line of poetry and a handful of evasive recollections. And yet she had been here. She had touched their lives, not deeply perhaps, but enough to leave a trace, enough to startle Emily into silence, enough for Helena to pour wine as though warding something off. Somewhere between the second aria and the third, I remembered a line from the Times crossword earlier that week. Clue. Marked by what once lingered. 6 letters. I hadn't solved it then, but now the answer came. Ghost. I let the needle run out. The room returned to quiet. A moth circled near the lamp, tracing invisible shapes onto the walls. Some people disappear all at once. Others fade, And some, the ones we don't notice until they're already gone, leave only the shape of their absence. She was one of those, and whatever had happened to Eleanor Payne, it hadn't begun in violence. It had begun in silence. Ghosts are rarely the kind that rattle chains. They're the ones who linger in footnotes, in half-names, in rooms no longer rented. I watched Lewis set the files down with a sort of tired finality, the kind that comes when even bureaucracy has nothing left to say. No records, he said. Not a student, not employed. No bursary, no bank activity, no bills, not even a phone. She existed in ink, not data, and only until May. Then, nothing. A ghost tenant. I looked again at the letter, now limp from rereading. It had been folded with care, the edges almost ornamental. The kind of precision that doesn't belong to strangers. This was no anonymous tip. This was mourning in disguise. She was silenced. That's all they ever wanted. I'd asked Lewis to check housing lists, birth registries, even the NHS. The result was the same. Eleanor Payne had arrived from nowhere and returned to it. No digital trace, but someone had known her well enough to write that sentence with absolute, exhausted certainty. Later that afternoon, a neighbor, a Mrs. Talbot, cardigan and a curtain-twitching sort, mentioned she'd seen someone in the Magdalene Court garden. A girl, mid-20s, sitting in the grass behind the ivy wall, crying. She hadn't gone to her. They all cry, don't they? That age, dissertation nerves or boy trouble. I didn't want to intrude. I nodded, thanked her. She seemed relieved to be of use. It was twilight when I returned to the court. The lamps had begun their half-hearted glow. Moths circled them like priests around dying candles. I found Emily in the common room, surrounded by papers and a typewriter so old it seemed more decorative than functional. She didn't look up when I entered. I waited. When she finally met my gaze, she seemed smaller. Or perhaps it was just the light. I asked her again, not unkindly, not accusingly, just a quiet repetition of the girl's name. Eleanor Payne. This time Emily didn't pretend not to know. She closed her folder slowly and folded her hands, almost in prayer. She wasn't like the others, she said. She didn't want to be remembered, not for herself, only for what she found. And what was that? I asked. Emily swallowed. Her voice, when it came, was soft enough to be mistaken for wind. She was writing about the women no one cites, the ones who published in chapbooks, the ones who read poems in kitchens, not halls, who wrote in margins on backs of laundry lists, who taught without title, whose names were removed by editors, husbands, tutors. She took a breath, long and slow. Eleanor thought she'd found them, the real ones, but not in published works, not in Bodley's catalogues. She said the traces were in personal collections, in coded poems, pseudonyms that mirrored college mottos, lines that rhymed with faculty surnames. And then what? I asked. Emily didn't answer immediately. She turned, reached into a folder, and handed me a page. Not photocopied, but hand-copied. A poem in shaky, slanted hand. She stands where footnotes end, in ink that never dries, behind the men whose names extend through all the scholars' lies. I looked up. Emily said she was working on a theory that some of the most celebrated male poets of a certain interwar Oxford circle had lifted lines, phrases, whole stanzas, but she didn't want to accuse anyone. She wanted to prove it, gently, elegantly. She believed in elegance, even in correction. I asked what happened when she shared it. Emily's voice cracked slightly. They dismissed her. Cecily said it was revisionist fantasy. Helena laughed. Julia just told her to be careful with words. And so, Emily looked at me, her eyes suddenly sharper than before. She said maybe the reason they were erased was because someone needed them to be. There was a long pause after that. I took the poem, slipped it into my coat. Outside, the wind had picked up, tossing the ivy leaves like scattered syllables. In my pocket, the copied poem rustled faintly, as though something still lived inside it. The special collections room was colder than memory. Not the cold of weather, but of preservation, that rarefied stillness born of paper, dust, and old intentions. I arrived late, the way one arrives at a confession, hesitant, half hoping not to be expected. The archivist, a pale graduate with uncut hair and an unusual devotion to categorization, said the diary had been returned open, spine strained, with a faint smudge across the final written page. He had noticed it only because he always checked for oils left by careless fingers. I admired that kind of obsession. It's the gentle ones who notice when something goes missing. The smear had dried to the color of old plum. Could have been ink, could have been something else. Beside it, caught in the gutter between pages, was a length of red ribbon, too thin to be a bookmark, too precise to be a mistake. It felt placed. He showed me the reader's log next. There it was. 2 weeks ago, Eleanor Payne. The signature looked hurried as though written while standing, but the name was unmistakable. Below it, a single title, Personal Diaries, Atterley, 1909-11. I asked who processed the request. He pointed at himself, then shrugged, said she was quiet. Odd accent. Looked as though she hadn't eaten. He thought perhaps she'd been crying. I didn't ask more. He had already told me what mattered. Atterley. Louisa Atterley. A name I remembered only vaguely. An echo from some dimly lit seminar, perhaps. Or a footnote in one of those anthologies compiled by the sort of men who apologize for their own introductions. The diary was leather-bound, cracked at the hinge. When I opened it, the air inside had the soft scent of lavender and regret. The handwriting began in careful, mannered script, the sort that belongs to women who once believed in their own futures. Later pages were different, compressed, urgent. Some entries had been crossed out, others overwritten. And then the torn leaf, a poem, scored through once, then copied again below. But this time in Latin. Poorly done, but deliberate. The Latin was stilted, the tenses inconsistent, as though the writer had learned it phonetically. I read it aloud, softly, to the echoing shelves. She left her name where they could not follow. Et nomen sum in umbris reliqui. I turned the page again. The ribbon had marked it precisely. On the facing leaf, a note. Jay sang this once. In Rome. It was never meant for men's ears. Not signed. Just a date. 1910. I sat with it for a while, the poem in my lap like a letter misdelivered by a century. Later, I walked to Magdalene Court. The streets were damp with last rain, and the sky hung low with something unspoken. The lights in the West Wing were on. I noted them without meaning to. Back in my flat, I found the Atterley volume Cecily Brooke had edited. It had the weary structure of an academic's compromise. Foreword longer than most poems, footnotes that apologized more than they explained. But Atterley's voice was there, buried beneath all the clarification, and in the index, unattributed lyrics, provenance unknown. I skimmed until I found one, recognized the shape of the verses. It was the same poem from the diary, this time with altered lines and a title I doubted Louisa had ever chosen herself. I stared at Cecily's footnote. Possibly composed during Atterley's Rome years. Interpretation uncertain. Translated here for clarity. Translated. Clarified or rewritten. I thought again of Julia. The photograph in her sitting room, the cracked frame, the memory of her voice from old broadcasts. Had she sung it? The diary said she had. In Rome, that matched. And Helena, She had studied Latin once, enough to attempt a clumsy rendering, enough to understand the threat. All of them, Cecily, Helena, Julia, had held fragments of Athalie in their palms. One through scholarship, one through performance, one through memory. And Eleanor had found the original. The words before they'd been softened, reshaped, misattributed. She'd found the poem before it was buried in someone else's name. No wonder she cried in the garden. Some truths, once unearthed, don't scream. They hum, quietly, like a needle left on a record, long after the aria has ended. The church had been converted years ago, no longer consecrated, though the acoustics still remembered prayer. The concert leaflet was printed on ivory paper, folded unevenly. The ink smelled faintly of varnish and time. I arrived early, sat near the back. I prefer to listen from the edge of things. Truth never enters through the front row. The program was lean. Vivaldi first, solemn, deliberate, and then Gluck's Orfeo ed Eurydice. Julia Levison, guest soprano. Her name printed without fanfare, nestled between two lesser-known chamber quartets, as if even the typesetter felt something unspeakable clung to her vowels. She walked onto the stage slowly, though not with hesitation. Not the gait of someone nervous, but of someone returning, to a place, to a sound, perhaps to an agreement made long ago. Her black dress shimmered only slightly, like polished mourning. She held her hands too still, the way singers do when they've forgotten how to be still any other way. And then, the voice. It was not what it had once been, but it held something more interesting than brilliance. Restraint. I listened not to the notes, but to the spaces between them, where memory sometimes lives when language cannot. She skipped the fourth verse. Only those who knew the piece, truly knew it, would notice. A verse in Italian, minor, rarely translated well. A lament not for loss, but for things never claimed in the first place. After the applause, gentle, reverent, I waited by the side door. The corridor behind the chapel smelled of dust and brass polish. A broken candlestick had been left on a windowsill like a relic. She saw me before I spoke. "You sang that in Rome once, didn't you?" She lowered her gaze. A small nod. Her voice, when it came, was quieter than on stage. "That's where I met her mother." She didn't say whose mother. She didn't need to. I asked if she'd known Eleanor. She didn't answer directly. Instead, she stared out the arched window toward a street lamp blinking into life. She said the mother had come to Rome in '68, on scholarship, fleeing some story she never told in full. Said she'd been talented. Said she sang, but not for people. They had shared a flat. Lived like sisters. That was the phrase she used. But it trembled. The child had come later. Unexpected. She remembered the night she was told, the silence afterward. And then, she said, she had made a promise. To watch over the girl if ever it was needed. Eleanor. She said the name as if it belonged in another century. I asked how the girl ended up at Magdalene Court. I offered her the room, she said, quietly. She needed somewhere that wasn't watched too closely. Why? Because she was already watching too closely herself. I let the silence gather between us. What did she find in the archives? Julia's hands tightened around the program. The paper crumpled slightly but didn't tear. The truth, I suppose. What kind of truth? The kind people think they want until someone finds it. And that made her dangerous. Not dangerous, she said. Just alone. That's worse. That's when people start to vanish. When no one thinks they'll be missed because no one dares say they noticed them in the first place. I asked one final question. Did you warn her? She looked at me then. Fully. With a kind of sorrow too elegant to be dramatic. I told her that silence had many kinds. She thought she was the exception. And were you afraid for her? No, she said. I was afraid of her. She turned then, folded the program twice more, and walked back into the dark hallway. I stood alone a while longer. In the vestry, a piano note lingered from some earlier tuning. Or maybe I imagined it. On the wall, an old hymn board still hung, though the numbers had long faded. Some truths arrive not in revelations, but in pauses, in the verse unsung, in the line skipped, in the child remembered not for her voice, but for whom she disturbed by listening. That night I went home and didn't play the record. Some arias are better left unfinished. It had been a long day, the kind that left you feeling not exhausted, but slowly unwound. I returned home with a drizzle on my coat and something less measurable beneath the ribs. A quiet, pressing weight, not grief, not suspicion. The shape of something I hadn't quite touched yet. The crossword was already open on the table, the pencil lying where I'd left it that morning. Dulled, slightly splintered, the way I liked it. Thursday's setter had a tendency toward the oblique, too clever by half. I scanned without expectation. She who holds the unsaid. 8 letters. I stared at it for longer than I should have. There's a moment in certain clues when the answer arrives not with triumph, but with inevitability, the quiet dread of recognition. The word took shape slowly, almost reluctantly. Silencer. It wasn't clever. It was precise. There's a difference. I poured a glass of red from the bottle I'd forgotten to chill. It tasted of warmth and dust like conversation left too long. I drank it anyway. The radio murmured somewhere in the kitchen, but I left it to its own mutterings. The poetry drafts Emily had given me were still folded in my coat pocket, softened by the damp. I spread them out on the table, smoothing each sheet like a coroner laying out evidence. Eleanor's handwriting was spidery but certain, feminine in rhythm, masculine in its refusal to explain. Metaphors bled into each other, rivers speaking in tongues, libraries whispering names, blood mistaken for ink. But one line caught and held. Magdalene's gates hold the mouth of the forgotten. I reread it 3 times. The phrasing was too architectural to be metaphor alone. Not guard or hide, but hold. And mouth, not voice, not name. Mouth. A place then. A mouth in stone. I stood up, walked to the bookshelf. Not poetry this time. Plans, maps, an old architectural study of the college grounds. Magdalene Court had once belonged to the Chapel Trust. Before partitioning, before the West Wing was converted, the lower level had been sacral. A chapel, abandoned after structural damp, disused for decades. Mouth of the forgotten. I rang Lewis. He answered on the second ring, groggy with either sleep or boredom. I asked him to meet me at the court. No uniform, just a torch. The night air had sharpened. Magdalen Court stood in silence, the lamplight catching its moss-stained angles with ecclesiastical patience. We passed the porter's lodge without explanation. Greaves had long since given up asking questions I wouldn't answer. The stairwell to the old basement was narrow, stone-lipped, and smelled of iron and mildew. A padlock hung on the door, snapped but rehooked to look intact. Someone had been down here recently, perhaps more than once. Lewis said nothing, but I saw the way he held his torch, slightly higher than needed, the beam trembling on the edges of pews, forgotten by use. The air was not still. It moved in shifts, like something remembering how to breathe. Hymnals, warped and peeled. Prayer books, colonized by spiders, and at the far end, the altar space, now bare. The floor beneath it sagged slightly. It was Lewis who noticed the soil. Freshly disturbed, too loose. He knelt, touched it, then looked at me. There was no ceremony to it. No tools, just gloved hands, methodical, reverent, a shallow grave, less than 2 feet. One silver earring, dulled with dirt. A single violin string snapped near the bridge, and beneath, cloth, skin, hair. We did not speak. The torch caught the shape of her arm, folded unnaturally, and a wrist, delicate, still marked with ink. It wasn't her body that confirmed it. It was the line of her fingers, curled slightly inward, as though even in death she had been holding something unspoken. Lewis stepped back. I remained. Not for long. Just enough to know that whatever she had found in the archives had not been the only truth she'd uncovered. There are silences that descend like mercy, and others that arrive like verdicts. Rain. Again. Not a downpour, but the kind of soft, persistent drizzle that stains more than it wets. A mist with memory. It followed me up the steps of Magdalene Court, collected in the cuffs of my trousers, smudged the edges of paper I hadn't meant to bring. I stood outside Cecily Brooks' door for a full half-minute before knocking. Some doors deserve pause. She opened it with the sharp elegance of someone used to receiving visitors on her terms. Behind her, books formed a skyline against every wall. The air smelled of cloves and pencil shavings. She gestured to the armchair. I declined. "You knew she was there," I said. "Of course." "I was head tenant. I kept the register." She paused, and I removed her from it when she left. "Left?" "Mutual agreement," she said without irony. Her tone was practiced, brisk, unoffended. There had been issues, she added. Late rent, late everything. And those ideas. Ideas. Cecily stepped toward a cabinet, opened it slowly, pulled out a folder I recognized. The edges were frayed. She handed it to me. "Her manuscript," she said. "Or attempt at one." I read, the first paragraph aloud. A treatise on silenced voices in Oxford's academic traditions, focused not on absence, but on erasure. Eleanor had cited unpublished verses, oral histories, letters that had never been catalogued. "Invented," Cecily said, "or wildly misinterpreted." She waved a hand. It was amateur sleuthing dressed up as scholarship, a fantasy that real historians can't indulge. I asked if she'd reported her. "No," Cecily replied. "I reviewed it, made my criticisms clear, and suggested she reconsider her focus. Then she left. You rejected her. I gave her feedback, and after that, she never submitted anything again. Perhaps she realized she wasn't cut out for the work." The word work hung there, unyielding, impersonal. I asked if she thought Eleanor's discoveries were a threat. "To what?" she said. "To footnotes? To tenure?" Her face didn't shift, but something behind her eyes did. I pressed further. The manuscript wasn't just rejected. It was ridiculed. A junior lecturer had read aloud parts of it during drinks, made a joke of it. Cecily had laughed, I was told. She didn't deny it. "I silence with the pen, not the hand," she said, folding her arms. It was the kind of line people prepare before questions are asked. Still, I wasn't convinced, not by her defense, but by its symmetry. Every word placed with care, as though edited in real time. She asked if she could go back to her work. I thanked her, politely, meaninglessly. That evening I walked back slowly. The cobbles held puddles like old regret. Somewhere near Magdalen Tower, the wind lifted a corner of paper from the gutter. It caught for a moment on my shoe, a shopping receipt, nothing more. But I bent to pick it up. Sometimes silence isn't just what's withheld. It's what fails to stick. I arrived home around midnight. The hall light flickered in its usual tired way. My coat hung heavier than it should have, but I left it be. There, beneath the door, was a folded note. No envelope. Cream paper, unlined. Emily's handwriting, unmistakable, slanted, uncertain, but thoughtful. She wasn't the only one who knew. 7 words, no explanation. I read it again. Then once more. There was no signature, just the scent of lavender and old paper. In the stillness of that room, something shifted. Not loudly, it's just slightly. I poured a glass of whiskey. Let it sit. And for the first time that day I wondered, not who had taken Eleanor's voice, but who had helped her try to keep it. By the time a scandal hardens into rumor, and rumor into local legend, the facts usually stop mattering. Helena Staunton had once played Ophelia in a provincial tour, had once dined with critics who wrote cruelly about her ankles, had once loved the wrong man with too much ceremony. And then, one misstep, one overheard line, one poorly sealed letter, and she'd become the kind of woman Oxford quietly hires and never fully forgives. She handled administration now, requests for equipment, disputes over timetables, rosters for kitchen use, and the archive key. That last part always mattered more than the others. I found her in her office that afternoon, surrounded by term schedules and dusty theater programs. Her desk was immaculate, but her hands trembled faintly when she reached for her glasses. I pretended not to notice. She offered coffee. I declined. I asked her about Louisa Atterley's diary. She blinked once, long and slow, then said she'd had it transferred from private holdings to Magdalen's archive years ago. Said it had been neglected. Said she believed Atterley was underread. Said it was Eleanor who reminded her of that. A voice too honest to last, she called her. And did you see her final performance? I asked. Helena didn't answer immediately. Instead, she turned to the window, though the view offered only ivy and stone. A one-night reading, I said. Not advertised, not recorded, just a whispered invitation to the women in the court. She nodded. Emily told me about it. Helena smiled faintly. She always liked the idea of rooms within rooms, echoes that don't stop at walls. That's why she called it one voice in many rooms. I told her I'd found the flyer in Emily's bin, a half-torn piece of card printed in Eleanor's hand. Nothing ornate, just a title and a date. No names. I asked again, were you there? She turned, adjusted the cuffs of her blouse, said nothing for a moment, then, I didn't attend. I played the voice. Her tone was flat, but the line was rehearsed, and that distinction, not attendance but performance, was where her shield lived. Eleanor had asked her to read Atterley's poems aloud, just her voice, behind a veil. The audience, 4 women, didn't know who was reading. That was part of it, she said. The anonymity, a shared breath, not a spectacle. And afterward? Eleanor had seemed distant, exhausted perhaps. She didn't speak much, just gathered the pages and disappeared into her room. Helena said she hadn't seen her the next day, or the one after. I asked how long the diary had been in her possession before that. Years, and she never noticed the Latin lines, the coded references, the entries about Julia. She looked at me then, not in surprise, in warning. Some things were meant to carry quietly, she said. And when Eleanor didn't? Helena's gaze didn't flicker. Her voice didn't rise. She was a girl who loved too deeply what was once discarded. That kind of love always gets punished. I didn't press further, not then. There was a kind of silence that arrives like a curtain, not to conceal, but to close the scene. Helena had performed too long to break character now. That night, I returned to my room and unfolded the flyer again. The ink had faded slightly, blurred by the pressure of someone's thumb. One voice in many rooms. Not many voices. One. Fragmented. Dispersed. As if Eleanor had already known she wouldn't last long. In one place? I thought again of the basement. The broken string, the earring, the shallow earth. Not discarded, not erased. Just returned to the silence she'd tried to name. and I wondered whether Helena had read the final page of the diary. The one not written in verse, just a single line. Some ghosts are louder than the living. The truth didn't arrive with sirens or revelation. It drifted in, threadbare, quiet, unwilling to announce itself. No confession, no melodrama, just a slow accumulation of silences that had finally begun to shape a name. Helena didn't resist. Not really. She folded her hands when we arrived and said she'd been waiting. Whether for me or for the past to catch up with her, I couldn't tell. Perhaps both. She didn't describe it as murder. She called it a moment in which something tipped. Words became raised voices. Raised voices became threat. And then, the garden. The river nearby. The night barely holding shape around them. Eleanor had confronted her after the recital, told her she'd finished the comparative analysis, that she'd found marginalia in Atterley's original notebooks, phrases, stanzas, even entire verses, that Helena had passed off as her own in a university publication almost a decade earlier, a small volume. Forgotten by most, not by Eleanor. She told her she'd included it in the manuscript, that she was going to publish with or without Cecily's endorsement. Helena said she tried to reason with her, that she warned her what it would do to reputations, to lives built from brittle scaffolding. Eleanor didn't raise her voice. She simply walked away, and Helena followed. The river was just there, a corridor of darkness threaded with silver. Eleanor had turned to say something. Helena reached to stop her. A wrist, a sleeve, a gesture that remembered too much theater. A slip, a sound, a cry, and then water. No witnesses. Just the darkness and the current and the silence that followed. Helena didn't go to the police. She said she told herself the river would carry her far, that it would look like accident, that people disappear all the time if they've lived quietly enough. And Eleanor had lived quietly enough. Lewis and I sat across from her as the statement was taken. She asked for no lawyer. She didn't weep. She asked only for one thing, that Atterley's original works be returned to the archive, unedited, as they were. That afternoon, the remains were formally identified. The silver earring had belonged to Eleanor's mother, a fact confirmed by Julia, who had once held it in her hand before a concert in Rome. The violin string came from Eleanor's case, found later beneath her bed, still half-packed. No birth certificate, no enrollment form, no lease, just the name she wrote once on the back of a pamphlet. Eleanor Payne. The name was recorded now, carefully, quietly, into a file that would be sealed with far less ceremony than the lives it touched. I didn't go home immediately. The air was too still, the light too sharp. I walked instead, out toward the Cherwell, past the punts, empty now, moored with indifference. The river moved as it always did, slow, unreadable. There's something about the water in Oxford. It doesn't reflect so much as it absorbs. Sound, light, memory. You look into it and see less of the surface than of yourself. I stood there for some time. Somewhere, faintly, impossibly, I thought I heard a voice. Not words, just a note, a breath caught in time. It might have been wind, or a boatman humming to no one, or nothing at all. But I stayed until it stopped. We rarely know the full shape of a life, even less so when that life has spent itself trying to unearth others. Eleanor had tried not to be seen, not to be remembered, only to remember. And for that, she was silenced. But the silence is never perfect. There is always an echo. Somewhere, even now, she sings.